Let's come back. We were in the first half, and notice that it isn't just a half, but it's now paired. Pairs tune. And the symmetry of pairs is resonant. And the larger dimensions of resonance come into play as a harmonic. So that in science, in 20th, late 20th, early 21st century mathematics, there's a whole field of development called harmonic analysis. Joan Erickson outlived her husband. He died at almost 94 years of age in 1982, 92 years of age. And she was able to bring into play a number of books of her own. And in the early 21st century, her steady understanding, the life cycle completed, was brought out in 1997. And in the next couple of years, there were a number of persons beginning to understand that her grasp of what she and her husband had worked on for decades was further maturing things. And that, in fact, as famous as Erickson became, that there was much more to discover. So in the early 21st century, 2002, Carol Hren Hoare published by Oxford, Erickson on Development and Adulthood, New Insights from the Unpublished Papers, that almost no one had seen. His wife, his son Kai T. Erickson, who became famous in his own right, they understood that these unpublished papers had many aspects to it. What comes out of this is a realization that the stages of life were worthy of each one of those 8 stages having a book. The first book that came out and established Erickson was Childhood and Society, and one of the really powerful volumes was called Identity, Youth, and Crisis, because of a tremendous emphasis on the cycle as a whole. One of the important volumes came out near the end of Erickson's life when he was almost 90, Life History and the Historical Moment. It is a quality, though, of development that is a tributary of a great stream of material that itself is a tributary to an enormous river of realization, but it does flow into an ocean. It goes off planet. It goes into the planetary star system in such a way that it has a carrier wave that goes beyond. And thus, the name for this year's presentations, the Parayana, the way beyond, the way across the limiting forms. And one of the very large for us limiting forms is this world. As long ago as 4,400 years ago, the reference wave of 2350 BC, the reference wave at that time carried by Sargon of Akkad and his daughter Enheduanna produced a quality of feminine wisdom that was able to carry the whole mythic horizon of a very sophisticated, multicultural quality into civilization. We have a disc of Enheduanna, but we have the reconstructed jewelry of Queen Puabi, who lived at that time. And you can see her royal headdress. It is a crown, but it is a crown that has a very specific comb. And the comb of her crown with the earrings are 7 stars. And those 7 stars are the stars of the Pleiades. So that they are the marker in terms of constellations immediately apparent, because in the visual calibration of sight, without aid of glasses or telescopes, the cluster of the Pleiades, the 7 sisters, is conspicuous and allows us to see another cluster very close to it, which is shaped like a V, or in ancient times and medieval times it's called the plow. And the bright reddish orange star at the point of the plow is Aldebaran in Arabic. And Aldebaran with the plow becomes the astrological constellation of Taurus, because they didn't see it as the plow, but the ancient seeing of it was not Chaucer's plow, but the horns of the bull, Taurus, of the way in which the power of insight is able to have that quality of emergence which brings a power into play, and the power that is the energy that develops, that Taurus brings into play and points, just as the plow, as Taurus, as Aldebaran points from the Pleiades to the constellation of Orion. The whole import of this throughout the development of civilization is important, and gains importance because after the Renaissance, in its Florentine, Venetian, Roman, Italian beginnings, moved into the northern parts of Europe, the northern Renaissance. One of the great artist figures who was a transmitter of that was Albrecht Dürer. Another transmitter of that was John Colet, who came from England, from London, and studied with Ficino and many of the others who were carrying that learning forth. He became the Dean of St. Paul's in London and started the St. Paul's School, which was a kind of a school then that was preparing whole new generations of persons to learn in a Renaissance way, a rebirth of the classical learning that came with the carrier wave some 1,500 years before, and now was going to open up to a new world, so that the most powerful idea of the Renaissance was that of the New World. And the discovery of America by Columbus in 1492 is a trigger moment in the historical development of persons as the human race as a whole. Yes, there were Vikings before, There were even Chinese before that we know now. But that 1492 is exactly, turns out, 500 years before the next carrier wave hits its penetrating moment. Its Aldebaran orange-red eye of penetration, the bullseye of being able to see all the way into an Orion, Orion the hunter, Orion which has a special kind of a quality to it. Major to it, of course, are the three stars at the belt of Orion, which are the way in which the great pyramids on Giza are arranged. And that those three stars have a relationship to two very powerful stars that then add to the quality of Taurus. And the one, as you look up to it on the right, is a blue-white giant Rigel. But the one that you look up to on the left is a giant orange-yellow star named Betelgeuse. These are Arabic names because the constellations were first understood in a constellational gestalt, wisdom, by the Arabs. Betelgeuse has a very powerful place in the constellations of the night sky because it forms one corner of an equilateral triangle. If one looks to the north of Betelgeuse, the really bright star, brighter even than the blue-white giant Rigel, is the star Sirius. To Egypt, it was called the dog star, Sothis. And the third star that's very bright, that forms with Betelgeuse and Sirius, is called Procyon, the star before the dog, Procyon. And Procyon, Sirius, and Betelgeuse make a perfect Pythagorean equilateral triangle, which then makes that whole constellation of Orion and Taurus and the Pleiades responsive to another constellation of two very bright stars that are always paired together, and in Latin, from the Greek, they were called Castor and Pollux, the twins. So that one has a whole swath of the starry expanse of the night sky, especially in the northern hemisphere, that one can begin to understand there is a way around, not limited to the plane of the ecliptic, to the stars in terms of where the sun's undulating pattern goes through the night sky, but there is another scalar swath of constellations. And it began to occur in the Renaissance. If one can sail around a spherical Earth, how many constellations could there be in the entire night sky around the entire Earth? And the answer to that is 88. Curious, not just the pair of eights. In Japanese, the word for rice has a part of the character, the root of it is 88. To the Japanese, they say, well, it conveys that this rice comes to you through 88 hands, so have a little humility. But it is a quality where it is not only 88, but it's like eights to a 10th power. And if you're working with powers of 10, if you're working with a decimal system, it means then that one can take the wisdom of this world, that you can go to powers of 10 And you can begin understanding that the constellations of the heavens from here look like this. And it took a long time to be able to, for the first time, look with that vision of the Renaissance into a new penetration. And that new penetration came about the time that the inheritor of Enneduanna, Queen Puabi, in France, where there was a Pleiad, there was a Pleiades, a Pleiad of Renaissance wisdom men who were understanding in their meetings in Paris that this was like some real thing that has come down to us. Something here is a larger wisdom that hasn't been harvested yet, that was planted then, developed to this extent. But there's even more. Two figures emerged out of that Renaissance as a new reference wave. One of them was Isaac Newton, and the other was G.W. Leibniz. And both of them developed a way to mathematize language in its writtenness, its written form, so that one could write a mathematique, so that you began to have all of the integral and differential infinite calculus of exactness with an Aldebaran-like penetration to not only the constellation of the seminal constellation of Orion, but its extension to the way in which Sirius, Sothis, was the rising of the Nile cycle for ancient Egypt, was the way in which a whole realization that one could go not only by the patterns of stars, but about the way in which they lifted above the horizon of the earth in a timely way, so that there were time forms of civilization related to the stars, related to the cycle of the way in which they rose and fall to the horizon of the earth, which with its mythology, with which its societies, its cultures, has something beyond it that is there in the stars. One of the great science fiction stories out of the classic science fiction vision is by Theodore Sturgeon, called The Stars Are the Styx, S-T-Y-X, and there is in the Parayana notes for this week a cover of a collection of his short stories, and the title was taken from that short story, The Stars Are the Styx, where Sturgeon is given a portrait as Charon, who rows the boat, taking those dead across the Styx. That if you drink the water of the Styx, a lethe, a forgetfulness comes into play, so that one is not taken to so much to a hell, but one is taken to an underworld where you do not remember anything. There's no memory at all. You are but zombie fodder, which is worse than torture. Sturgeon, in The Stars of the Styx, headlined the very first issue of a revolutionary science fiction magazine called Galaxy in October of 1950. The very first installment of the very first novel to be serialized in Galaxy, oddly enough, is called Time Quarry. by Clifford Seamack. Clifford Seamack was the editor of the Minneapolis Star newspaper and one of the great early science fiction vision writers in the 1930s already. Sturgeon began in the late 1930s, and we're going to talk about another one of his stories that we already mentioned a presentation or so ago. But The Stars Are the Sticks is the great novel in this issue, and it has, every few years someone thinks to call me Charon. It never lasts. I guess I don't look the part. Charon, you'll remember, was the somber ferryman who steered the boat across the river Styx, taking the departed souls over to the other side. He's usually pictured as a grim, taciturn character, tall and gaunt. I get called Charon, but that's not what I look like. I'm not exactly taciturn, and I don't go around in a flapping black coat. I'm too fat, maybe too old too. It's a shrewd gag, though calling me Charon. I do pass human souls out. For nearly half of them, the stars are indeed the sticks. They will never return. I have two things I know Charon had. One is that bitter difference from the souls, the dead I deal with. They have lost only one world. The other is before them. But I'm rejected by both. The other thing has to do with a little-known fragment of the Charon legend, and that, I think, is worth a yarn. The previous story to this that we have taken a look at in the Parayana is a story that headlines Volume 2 out of 14 volumes of the collected stories of Sturgeon, Microscopic God. And the first printing of Microscopic God was in the April 1941 issue of Astounding Science Fiction magazine, where the editor, John W. Campbell, Jr., talks already about Sturgeon in these glowing ways that the editor of Galaxy, H.L. Gold, talked about Sturgeon. And in fact, it's a very fond thing for me because I have my first three issues of Galaxy from 1950 signed for Roger with all warmest good wishes, H.L. Gold, because I had been taken here in Los Angeles to Park La Brea to meet H.L. Gold for an afternoon by Theodore Sturgeon, who's a very dear friend of mine. And it's interesting because the second issue, November 1950 of Galaxy, has a feminine focus of a pair on the moon. And in the third issue, December 1950, it has a wise old woman whose pet is a fabulous creature with a young boy, young man, that she is tutoring, and it's called Second Night of Summer by James H. Schmitz, who lived in Orange County. And he was famous later on in a couple of years for writing a great science fiction novel, The Witches of Caries, that the three graces in a stellar world possibility are three magical young girl women who are natural clairvoyants, telepaths, teleporters, and the starship captain thinks he's just taking them on his trade route as cargo to be taken someplace. They take over his starship and his business and everything he could imagine. A Microscopic God is about a scientist on an island who discovers how to reduce the sentient life form of man to microscopic levels, what we would call today on the level of below bacteria to viruses. And because they're so tiny and their life history, their life cycle is so fast that many hundreds and thousands of cycles for them occur within short days or weeks. And so their creator, they begin to understand, is God. That this scientist then becomes God. In the 21st century, this is the website of Natural Society. The date is 13th of September 2014. Mad scientists genetically modified microhumans to be farmed for drug testing by 2017. We're already in it, over our heads. It is a quality of actuality that came into play when the Pleiad was being formed in Paris. The outstanding intellectual adventurer was Madame de Châtelet. This is her in front of her great book of translation that came in a very special way. She was the inheritor of a great royal title. She was a marquise, and their palace was Moonville, and not far from it was a chateau which was given to her to have her own private life and developments, because she wasn't into socializing so much on the royals level. She was into, like the Pleiad, of understanding wisdom in a very deep way, and she was masterful. She could read Greek and Latin, French, German, English, perfectly fine. And her live-in boyfriend at the time, the chateau was called Siri, and it was about 30 miles from Luneville Palace. And there, this is a biography of her by Judith Zinsler. And it just came out a couple of years ago. Du Chaillet's change from helpmate to published author in her own right began as a consequence of Voltaire's decision to enter the Académie Royale des Sciences 1738 prize competition. They would have a competition, and for the first time in European history, a woman submitted a written treatise to them, and neither she nor Voltaire won the competition, but their works were so interesting they were published. And so no woman had ever made her own submission to the Académie Royale des Sciences. Only with her own entry, however, could Du Chaillet ensure that the true results of their experiments and the conclusions to which they led were presented, because in her chateau, she had a laboratory made to house their experiments. And so she began to understand that what was at stake here was not to accept the kind of limits of a kind of a philosophic method that was the rage at the time, traced back to René Descartes. His philosophic method of the sciences, which was really reductive. In the early 20th century, the great engineer who mastered mathematics and began to question Descartes in the same way was Edmund Husserl, who was the founder of phenomenology. Well, Madame Émilie du Chaillet is the founder of the way in which a feminine wisdom came back into play into Enlightenment France. And she The decision would give her her first taste of la gloire, what she identified in her Discourse sur la bonheur as the fame that eluded women because of their exclusion from the usual routes to prominence. And the routes to prominence for her had not counted since she was a young girl. Her mother was an actress famous in Paris, but her father recognized that his daughter had all of these talents, and so he arranged for her to have special instruction, special tutors brought, and she was able to understand enough that one of her tutors, a self-serving kind of a prig named Maupertuis, and some people say that she was taken with him and that he became her lover. This is not the case at all. He was just a tutor that grew very fond of her. She eventually, his name was Fontenelle, quite famous at the time in France. Du Chaillet's dissertation on fire appeared just as she began supervising the printing of her Institutions de Physique. Reviews of her essay in the Memoirs des Travaux and the observations followed in the first half of 1739, and from there she began to understand that she had to completely refine her institutions of physical science because she had not understood the math perfectly. So she went back to Isaac Newton, and she is the one then that made her own translation of Newton's Principia Mathematica into French. And because she was able to do this, people who had tried to read Newton in England, he wrote in Latin, not in English, were making all kinds of transformation errors, sloppiness, or presuppositions. And all of a sudden, here comes a French woman who is so exacting, exactement. What is being shown here must have a correlation to the laboratory, which is what one can find out, is this working together. And her translation of Newton into Français was revolutionary. The Enlightenment was followed by the French Revolution. And in the French Revolution is when you have a whole generation, not just at the guillotine cutting off heads, but a revolution in mathematics. Because it's there that you had men of genius able to read Newton in her French with the exactness presented to them that they could understand, well then, if this is so. And she keeps saying there are universal principles. There is a method of testing it by experiment, so that experience can have a visionary transform, and it can be confirmed by a scientific method of proving it, so that it comes back into play that you refine your mathematics, not just by the presuppositions, but by understanding that universal principles will disclose themselves eventually through patient inquiry that includes doing something about it. So that her legacy was this kind of theory and practicality together. That one doesn't have to go to some kind of a doctrinaire. All of a sudden, science takes off. She's a contemporary, born in 1706. She's a contemporary with Benjamin Franklin, who was born in 1706. She unfortunately died in childbirth in 1749. She was not quite 43 years of age. And in 1747 is when Benjamin Franklin had completed all of his investigations into lightning and electricity. And his essays were published in England, Peter Collins, and immediately translated into French. And so you have the beginnings of the lightning strike form that so beautifully shows us the new lightning of the supergalactic structure of the universe, where our galaxy is an Aldebaran spear point pointing out to the complement supergalactic cluster of Pisces Perseus, where we see that there is a pair that in 1 billion light years diameter has a large swath of importance. Someone characterized it as a corner of the universe. It is an angle of vision, a whole geometry of differential consciousness and a science of kaleidoscopic consciousness can come out of that kind of geometry. We have already made huge progresses in the last 200 years of differential geometry. Now it is time for kaleidoscopic geometry. More next week.